current economic theory sees both humankind and our economic activity as being separate from nature. It's not quantified, it's an externality. It's just not part of the picture. And so in that way, the modern economic thought is incomplete. This belief that humankind and our economic activity are separate from nature rather than being surrounded by it, this lack of understanding of our place on this planet and our place within its systems of ecology, has led to critical failures in both capitalist modes of production as well as the failed Marxist revolutions of the Soviet states. Of course, many of the states which we call communist really are nothing other than state capitalists. The workers don't actually own the means of production. The means of production are owned by the state rather than a private individual. But either way, the workers aren't in control. There's no democracy. There's not that sharing of information between the people doing the work and the people benefiting from the work. In talking briefly about this idea of the natural man, Marx hits upon two concepts which I myself have arrived upon prior to ever reading anything written by Marx. The first idea that Marx hits upon with his example of natural man is the illusion of the individual as an independent entity within society. And the second is what he calls the accumulation of labor, and what I call the evolution and fossilization of intelligence. But we'll get to that in a little bit. I didn't think of either of these two concepts as being particularly Marxist or even political in nature. The first concept, the illusion of the individual in society being separate, much as we think of humankind and our economic activities being separate from nature, there's also a tendency for humans to think of ourselves as being separate from the rest of society. Karl Marx, in writing, actually I'll get the book, talking in the first chapter of Das Kapital about the natural man, Marx states, "The further back in history we go, more does the individual, and thus also the productive individual, appear as dependent, as part of a greater whole. First, still quite naturally in the family, and expanding thence into the tribe, later in various forms of community resulting from opposition between and amalgamation of tribes. Not until the 18th century in bourgeois society do various forms of association and society appear to the individual simply as a means to his own private ends. Man, in the most literal sense, is a political animal. Not just a social animal, but an animal which can achieve individuation only in society. The production of the isolated individual outside of society is as much an impossibility as the development of language without individuals living together and talking to one another. Human beings are political animals precisely because we rely on one another." While Marx just briefly glosses over this as a concept, I think it warrants further discussion. It should be common knowledge to all of you that human beings do not hatch from eggs, as lizards do, fully equipped to survive in the wild. That doesn't happen. We're enculturated. We're completely dependent on our parents or other parental figures to teach us the skills that we need to survive. Even the most rugged of individuals find themselves in the positions they do partially because of their own work, but mostly because of the gifts, of the investment of time and energy and sharing that others have given to that individual. If we look into our economic system, this is even more true. In an economic sense, though it may readily seem that we are completely alone if we care to be, nothing could be further from the truth. Take any manufactured product in your household and just take a look at it. That product that you're looking at is the result of the accumulated labor of countless people preceding you. Take, for instance, something simple like a loaf of bread. One doesn't need to interact with other people in order to acquire a loaf of bread. One could go into a grocery store late at night when there's no one else there and use an automated checkout and never look at another individual the entire time. But the entire transaction is only possible because of other people. The wheat from which the bread is made was grown in a pasture that was tilled and harvested by a farmer. The grain, after harvesting, is threshed and then sold by a variety of brokers multiple times before finally being treated, turned into flour, and stored. Eventually some portion of that flour that was milled and stored is going to be shipped off to a bakery. That bakery is staffed by chefs, cooks, who will mix that flour in with a variety of other ingredients, and you could do a life cycle analysis for every single one of those products, from eggs to salt. Every single one of those things employs people the whole way and is completely dependent on people to make it happen. After the bread is baked and loaded onto trucks, which are operated by truck drivers, people. Only finally, after all of this and the bread has been distributed to your particular local grocery store, are you able to pick it up and hold it in your hand. Then, of course, there's the automated checkout, which despite it taking a job from somebody who could be working as a cashier attendant, it still needs to be serviced, needed to be developed, that requires people. It needed to be created, that required machinists, engineers, people on an assembly line. So this humanless transaction that you're engaging in, purchasing this loaf of bread without interacting with anybody, is actually dependent on a vast number of people. And what Marx is pointing out here is that an individual, to go through all of this trouble to create his own process by which he can procure bread from wheat from the fields, and eggs from chickens, and salt from salt mines in Africa, and then create a point of purchase so that he can then purchase the bread from himself and then enrich himself through that transaction of capital, is completely absurd. Economic independence is actually economic dependence. Money is standing in for the labor of countless other people, which you're dependent on. And not only that, but the exchange of goods and services in a market is an inherently social act. But we treat it as though it isn't. The use of money allows us to separate ourselves from the individuals that come prior to the product. The use of money allows us to separate ourselves from the process of production, from the people responsible for that production, giving us the illusion that we are an individual in this economy, that we are not dependent on others, when, again, nothing could be further from the truth. We are entirely dependent on others. An individual who trades only in money, does nothing for himself, but uses that money to acquire material wealth for himself, is actually one of the most dependent individuals in an economic system. Everything that he owns, everything that he eats or otherwise uses, was created by somebody else. Even if he was some sort of technological genius engineer. The same is true of inventions. This is true of anything that can be invented. There's no such thing as an entirely new idea. All intelligence is only made possible by prior intelligence. So this brings us to the concept of accumulated labor. Now, when I came across this concept on my own, I came across it very differently. I was thinking about it as taking intelligence and making it a concrete object. So in that way, technology is actually something that's separate from us and evolving on its own trajectory parallel to us. So I first came across this concept while I was at the Common Ground Country Fair in Unity, Maine. I was over at the Primitive Skills tent and came across a demonstration, which is there every year, of a very simple lathe made out of a simple rock chisel and a couple of sticks holding up another log, which is used as the I don't know what all the parts of the lathe are called. Now, what was remarkable to me is the person who was demonstrating the lathe told me that this primitive lathe and chisel is the only tool that can both be made from scratch and make itself. So you can use a lathe and chisel to make a lathe and chisel. And actually, the second lathe and chisel that you make will be slightly better than the first lathe and chisel. And of course, thinking about that, I immediately tried to prove him wrong by thinking through all of the different tools that I could think of that could both be used to make themselves and could be made from scratch. And honestly, I couldn't think of anything. Everything that I could think of needed some sort of previous engineering and another set of tools to build that tool. To truly make a piece of technology from scratch, even something simple like a rubber tire, one would need to engineer and build mechanisms to extract the raw materials from the environment. You would have to engineer and build the machines that would melt, vulcanize, and mold the rubber. And you would have to engineer and create all of the machines that extract the raw materials and produce the actual tire itself. And you would have to engineer and produce the machines that make those machines. So by doing this to make an item from scratch, one finds themselves creating the entire history of that technology, the entire evolution of that technology, going back to its very most basic parts. At first glance, a lot of these things can be taken for granted because we've had a lot of these tools around for centuries upon centuries. And even the most mundane and untechnical seeming items actually have an incredible legacy of both labor and intellect from people who preceded us. So here again we are bumping up against the edge of this fallacy that we are individuals within society. We're not. Any individual owes any success that he or she has to all of the prior people that came before them, and their intellect, their errors, and their successes. Previously, we took all of the labor and intelligence and ingenuity in making a loaf of bread for granted. So in this instance as well, by taking the legacy that we all share of ingenuity, experimentation, failure, success, and then the fossilization of labor for granted, we allow for this illusion of the self-made individual separate from society to rise. But this image is a false one. Every inventor, every tycoon, every business owner owes everything that they have to the labor and intellect of those who came before. The intellectual legacy that we all enjoy for free is taken for granted. And then through intellectual property, capitalists seek to enclose that knowledge and make it private, separate from that public legacy that we all share. So how do we move forward from here? Because we're killing the planet. This idea of separation from nature, this idea of our ecosystems being separate from us, that we're separate from it and don't interact with it, which is patently false. We're at a point now where we are over-extracting resources from the environment far faster than they're able to be replaced. Even renewable resources are being extracted faster than they're able to be renewed. So what's the way forward? I think one, we need to recognize, as Marx points out, and as indigenous people have known for millennia, that we are not separate from nature, that we are absolutely integrally a part of nature. And though many of the things that we do may not be in harmony with nature, we need to start doing it because nature's going to kick our ass if we don't smarten up. I think there's a connection here as well, connecting the environmental movement to the labor movement. A classic dichotomy that's often played out in American politics is the pitting of labor against environmentalists. The idea that doing what is right to be in harmony with the environment is bad for the economy. Labor unions, still operating under capitalism, sure, will probably find that they are having to overproduce, over-extract continually because they're operating under capitalism, which requires them to do those things. So saying don't do those things would mean under a capitalist system that they would lose their jobs. However, under a cooperative system, those who are laboring would only be producing what's needed. By producing to satisfy need rather than satisfy greed, we eliminate overproduction, over-extraction, or at least significantly reduce it, which puts us more in line and in harmony with nature. So it's the same fight. The fight of the environmentalist, the fight of the socialist, the fight of the labor unionist is the same fight. We need to shift from me to we.